Item 26, open 30-day comment period for the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. I would take a motion in regards to this item.
Motion to open 30-day comment period.
Second. Any questions or comments? I believe we have Chris Plummer with us tonight to just give us spend a few minutes with us to give us an overview of the study that he performed over the last 2 or 3 months.
All right, thank you. Good evening, Honorable Mayor, City Council. As you mentioned, we were asked to conduct an analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. And what I'm going to do is just to go over the basis of what we call the AI and give you a synopsis of some of our findings and recommendations, and then open the floor for some questions. So why conduct an AI? This is a requirement of HUD for grantees or entitlement communities that receive federal block grant funds. The City of Fremont happens to not receive its funds directly from HUD, but receives it through the state. So you voluntarily decided to prepare an AI. The basis of the AI is grounded in the Fair Housing Act, which prohibits housing discrimination based on race, sex, color, religion, national origin, disability, or familial status, what we call the protected classes. The intent was to eliminate discriminatory housing practices and end housing segregation. As part of receiving funds, HUD funds, HUD requires that a city certifies that it will do something called affirmatively furthering fair housing, and essentially that is to identify any impediments that there might be to fair housing within the public and private sector, to take actions to address those impediments, and then to keep records and track the implementation of those actions. What exactly are impediments? They are simply any actions, omissions. We talk about sins of commission and omission. Any actions, omissions, decisions that restrict housing choice and availability of housing for persons within those 7 protected classes we mentioned. And there are 2 types of those impediments. Those that are taken because of someone's membership in one of those protected classes. So if a landlord refuses to rent to a family with children, that is considered an impediment because it's an action taken because of someone's familial status. Then there are another set of impediments that are a little bit different and are harder to address because there was no intent to discriminate. It's just that whatever actions or omissions or decisions that were taken ends up having an effect or what is called a disparate impact on persons in those protected classes. In the past, HUD has really not enforced AI, this part of the requirements as much. However, since 2 years ago, HUD has basically clamped down on that, and what they've started doing is really requiring enforcement of the AI. There's a proposed rule that came out in July 2013, which includes HUD is going to actually provide data for example, on segregation of housing. It's also going to define exactly what this study will look like, because you could have a study like what we did that's comprehensive, or you may have one that is 20 pages and is not as comprehensive. In fact, there was a major lawsuit brought against Westchester County in the state of New York, and part of it was that they kept certifying every year that they were affirmatively furthering fair housing, but they weren't doing anything like that, So the process that we took to do this AI is that we reviewed data in all those areas that you see on the slide. We conducted public meetings, we did surveys, focus groups, we did key persons interviews, and in fact, I would just like to state that the response from this community was unusual. I don't get this much response. In fact, some of the focus groups were very lively, and some of the public meetings were very lively in terms of debates. But we had I would say we probably had about over 150 persons who actually attended these sessions. We also did surveys to residents, and to date we have about 111 responses from residents, and we have about 16 responses from professionals. The process is that we identify impediments and we offer recommendations, both the impediments that had been identified in the previous study and any current impediments that have been identified in this 2014 study. We then prepare recommendations for review and acceptance by the city, and out of that, HUD expects the city to develop an action plan and actually allocate funding to fair housing activities, and to develop a tracking system to address fair housing in the city. Just to note that there have been some demographic shifts within the community. The most significant of them has been that in the 2000 census, 4% of the population was of Hispanic origin. In the 2010 census, almost 12% of the population is now of Hispanic origin. What's the implications of that? Why is that important? Because it means that it opens the potential for discrimination against an increased group that is part of the protected classes. And one of the things that we have suggested throughout the study is a proactive approach as opposed to a reactive approach. Do you wait until there is evidence of actions or activities or discrimination, or do you actually do some actions to prevent that? No, you may not get rid of it. People are people, but are there some things that as a city you can do to address it? So I wanted to just give a summary of what the community surveys found, and the breakdown, as you can see on the chart, was largely Caucasian. The Hispanics had the lowest response as a percentage of their population. We had 16 responses from professionals. We also had persons who felt they had first-hand knowledge of discrimination. That was a significant number. Also, 16.8% of the respondents felt that they themselves had experienced housing discrimination, and 20.8% felt that they had second-hand experience of housing discrimination, someone who they know had experienced housing discrimination. We also saw where the major sources of housing discrimination occurred in rental housing, where 85.3% of the persons felt that they were discriminated against when it came to rental. The highest perceived basis for discrimination was on the basis of race, where 50% of the persons who felt they experienced discrimination, it felt it was on the basis of race. After that, you had about 38.9% based on limited English proficiency, which is tied back to national origin. Then when it came to familiarity with city-provided housing or social services, what we saw there was that a very low percentage, 24% of the persons surveyed felt that they were familiar with fair housing or social services provided by the city. None of the Spanish language survey respondents were familiar with fair housing or social services. 50% of the respondents had not seen or heard any information regarding fair housing in the city. And then in terms of knowledge of fair housing laws, 30% of the persons surveyed felt that they had no knowledge at all of fair housing laws, and about 60% said they were somewhat knowledgeable. The rest said they were very knowledgeable. So these are some of the impediments that we identified, and we broke them down into several categories: public policy, real estate, banking and lending, and I'm just going to go through them. There was some risk of inadequate planning to meet the needs of protected class members. It was felt that the definition of family may discriminate against unrelated persons in households. Group facilities, we saw some impediments there, that group home facilities are not treated in the same way as single-family residential homes. And we also saw that the rental occupancy ordinance may discriminate against Hispanic based on some of the data and responses that we got. And we also saw as an impediment that the ordinance adds an additional step to securing housing, especially for persons who are low income. And although income is not a protected class, the persons who are in the protected classes, whether minorities, persons who are with disabilities, or persons with children, tend to be overrepresented in the low-income classes, and they have issues of credit, deposit, and so on in terms of securing housing, location, access to transportation, and so on. And based on the data, we believe that the ordinance adds one additional step, even just out of the way that it is perceived. So some of the recommendations that we had around public policy is really including more demographic data in planning documents, looking at some of the planning and zoning regulations and making changes, implementing the HUD requested actions to mitigate against the effects of the rental ordinance, using telephone, public television, social media access, and so on to get word out about fair housing issues, because not everybody has the internet and or comes to meetings to hear information. And then assessing the impact of the ordinance, whether through an opinion survey, doing fair housing testing, within the next 12 to 24 months, because it's still early days yet to figure what's the impact of this, and there have been challenges in the implementation of this, I understand, as a result of exactly how do you enforce it. So how do you then assess the impact of it if you are unable to really enforce it in some ways. Real estate impediments, those centered more around inadequate supply of affordable housing and shortage of accessible housing units. We recommended developing an affordable housing strategy that may include housing trust funds, inclusionary zoning, using low-income housing tax credits more, setting up tax increment financing districts, encouraging more multi-family affordable housing, and improving accessibility. Also, you have CDBG funds. Those funds can be used to provide accessibility repairs to persons who may need it. We saw discriminatory lending practices in that there are higher denial rates to applications in minority census tracts. All the city, well, not all, but one of the strategies that the city can use is really to coordinate with lenders to see how there are more housing opportunities for persons in some of those minority census tracts. Then fair housing education and awareness. Based on some of the survey results I pointed out before, we felt that there is a need for more education and awareness on fair housing issues in the community. We recommended targeting minorities and persons with limited English proficiency, continuing public education, and maybe even establishing a volunteer citizen committee to propose activities to address those impediments, and allocating funding for fair housing activities. The next step in the process, once you accept the recommendations, is that there has to be a fair housing plan established with goals and objectives and specific activities, and a timeline for implementation of those activities, which HUD will hold you to, and allocating funding for fair housing activities such as testing, education, data analysis, perhaps funding a fair housing agency to assist with these activities, and then assessing your progress on this and what has been the impact of the fair housing activities that you carry out. Any questions, any comments? Okay.
Any questions?
I guess, I think one of your items was, do we accept the recommendations? Do we have any choice?
That's always a question. Well, you do have it. The recommendations that are proposed are several, and you don't have unlimited pockets or deep pockets, I presume, like any other government agency. So those recommendations that you feel that you can address, then those are the ones that you accept. The only caveat I would put to that is HUD expects you to do more than just what is typically called best efforts, where you do the minimal, but rather that you try to do more than the minimal.
One of the recommendations was, once it's established, to begin a testing procedure. Is that implemented by the city? Is that someone we hire, or what's that process? Or recommendation on
it would be an agency that you would hire that does testing. HUD fund several agencies that do testing across the state, across the country. And testing is really one of the best ways of identifying whether discrimination exists or not. Because it would, consist of a couple goes and a testing couple goes and the landlord says, yes, we have a unit available, and they say, okay, we'll look around, and they leave, and then another family, might be a minority couple or a family with children, comes, and the unit all of a sudden 5 minutes later the unit is not available, so but I don't expect that is true.
So I guess pertaining to that, the city obviously doesn't control the landlords or the lenders. One of the items on here is, checking into any kind of lending practices. So I understand our role as a city is to help get the education out there and to make sure the materials are available. If we do that, as our plan states, and any testing by HUD or any other group shows that there's still those practices going on, at what point, all we can do is try to educate and have the materials available. True? Or is there some sort of backlash if entities outside of the city itself?
Well, you have no control over the entities outside of the city, technically. However, you may work with banks who come to you for subsidies to assist home buyers that they're helping. You have leverage there because you're providing funding to a transaction that benefits them. So you have leverage, and you assume that everybody is trying to do the right thing. So with that assumption and with whatever leverage you have, you use that. Or if you do testing and the results come out that there's discrimination going on, it then serves as a basis for any agency or any person to bring lawsuits against those agencies. For example, a major lawsuit that was against Wells Fargo Bank was just settled recently, and I think another one is pending against Bank of America, where it was shown somebody went out, an agency went out and actually did surveys in different neighborhoods and found that those two banks in minority neighborhoods, they were not keeping up foreclosed properties that they owned. They were not advertising them for quick sale. However, in non-minority neighborhoods or low-income neighborhoods, they were actually keeping those pristine and making sure that they were on the market and being pushed. So a lawsuit was filed against them on that basis. So.
Sure, and I completely understand that. I guess where I'm trying to figure out is city's requirements and liability versus a private institution.
Well, the only thing that you can do with a private institution is try to initiate as the leader in the community, initiate with them, hey, we have noticed in your mortgage disclosure data that there are some areas in which the rates of denials are way higher than other areas. Is that something you're addressing? Is there anything that we can help you with? Can we work with you? Are there some incentives maybe around education because it may not necessarily be that they are discriminating in terms of that. It may just be that there are so many persons within that census tract who have no credit or bad credit. So is there a way that the city can work with them, maybe providing home buyer credit counseling, funding those types of activities to get that denial rate down?
The challenge I see here is the banking institutions, and this is one that's a little frustrating because they're highly regulated, and there are so many regulations and guidelines that they have to fall within that, and I'm sure there's banks that maybe do discriminate, but there's a lot of that just is it's purely the numbers, and people have bad credit and they can't take them.
Right.
So is that really discrimination, or is it's part of the overall poverty issue?
Right.
It really isn't. They're trying to discriminate. It's just based on the regulations, they can't provide the loans.
Right. And in cases like that, you're not really, this is not a reactive approach. This is saying, hey, how can we ensure that in these other census tracts we can get some prospective potential buyers to where they are able to be qualified for loans? Or are there some products that we can help you to, we can work with you on that will make it, the lending, the approval rates in those communities increase? So it's more of a proactive stance rather than punitive. I mean, you have no control in terms of punitive approach with the bank. So it's more of a collaborative and a proactive type of approach.
Yeah, go ahead.
What Gene and I will spend some time doing is also, because we kicked some of this stuff to Justin, who's helping with planning, and we will be working on this in the next 30 days as to, out of these recommendations, what as a city do we feel we could do? Can we look at the definition of family?
Right.
Can we look at zoning? What efforts have we made towards education that maybe we need to change, because we're not reaching the audience. The things that we've done in the past aren't penetrating into the community. What changes could we make? And with some of those, what we'll try to have to propose is, what would it cost us to do these things? And that would be part of what council, when they accept the recommendations, would be the plan that we would then be expected to carry out. And so not everything that's recommended can we afford to do, nor may have the power to do. But what can we do is now on us, based on the recommendations we're getting. What can we maybe physically, feasibly, financially do, and then hold ourselves accountable to getting it done, and then measure, was it effective? That's the other part of it too. We have to follow up on, did the steps we take, are they changing things? Are our statistics getting better, or are they getting worse? And then we may have to do something else if we're not making any progress. So this is again a step that requires now us to come up with some kind of plan of what of these recommendations are possible, which ones could we take on, and then how do we monitor it? What steps can we do to monitor?
Right.
So this is a good first step.
Yeah, and some of them are easy fixes, use of social media, use of a telephone number, public television. If I'm not sure, I can't recall if you have public television here. For example, since I started this assignment, I think there is more fair housing information on your website than before. So some of those are easier fixes. Yeah.
Any other questions for Chris?
Just a question for Dale then. Is part of the comment period department heads, staff getting back to us on the tactics laid out in the timeline and responding to those?
That's what we'll be
either, yay or nay, or don't have the resources, have the resources. Can't do it in 1 year, maybe 3. That's going to be part of our comment then.
And then this will be published for a 30-day period for the public to provide comments to it, and then it will be finalized and I guess approved by the council. Yeah.
Very good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have a motion and a second to open the 30-day comment period. Any other questions? Cast your votes.
Stain?
Yes.
Navarette?
Yes.
Bixby?
Yes.
Johnson?
Yes.
Coons?
Yes.
Hoppy?
Yep.
Anderson?
Yes.
Early Wayne?
Yes.
8 ayes, Your Honor.